Welcome to the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I've been talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today is our 12th and final episode in Season 1 of the podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking with David Degner on the choices we make. David Degner is a photojournalist who has mainly been based in Egypt since 2010. Before that, he freelanced in Florida, interned at the St. Petersburg Times, and studied photojournalism and philosophy at Western Kentucky University. His greatest achievement to date is editing and mentoring photographers for Panorama, a platform showcasing the best photojournalistic work from Egypt. So could we start by you just telling us a little bit about your work?
I got into photojournalism because 9/11 happened while I was in high school, and we went to war in Iraq soon afterwards. And I could see how ignorant I was of the Middle East and Iraq and Islam, and also how ignorant the rest of America was also at that point. And saw photojournalism as a way of kind of educating myself and an excuse to go learn. So since the beginning, I kind of knew that I wanted to go be a photographer based in the Middle East. I was also quite shy back when I was in high school and such. And I would set goals of myself to go be able to talk to that person and get a photograph of that person. And this having the camera became a way to force myself to interact with people, basically. And it continues kind of in that way that with my camera, if I see something interesting, I just go say, hey, I'm a photographer, and people will let me into their lives or whatever they're creating. And you can see that in the types of photo stories that I work on. A lot of my personal projects are just things that I find interesting and go ask for more. And then eventually I start taking photos. And so that's where a lot of my more personal work comes from. But a lot of my photography is assignments. When I was in Egypt for the last 10 years, I would get emails to go make a portrait of someone. Usually a writer had been working on a story for weeks or months. And then I'm kind of the last person to get called that, hey, we need a portrait of this person. You have an hour, go make a portrait. So there's a wide variety of the type of work that I do with my photography.
Absolutely. So some sort of longer term and some more quick turnaround projects, I guess, that you're brought into. I'd like to talk a little bit about your experience of studying photojournalism formally, because that's sort of been a theme that has come up a fair bit in the interviews that I've done about sort of maybe a kind of imposter syndrome that a lot of people who have not done formal training have. And sort of, I was wondering, I guess, if you could talk a little bit about what you gained from doing that photojournalism course and how that shaped your approach in a way that maybe you wouldn't have a certain set of tools had you not done that course.
Yes, studying photojournalism at Western Kentucky University was a 4-year bachelor's degree in photojournalism. And it was useful in that it really the biggest use that most of these programs have is that they help you make connections, and they help you eventually get your foot in the door to get that internship that eventually gets you in touch with editors, that gets you jobs. My university was very focused on newspaper photojournalism, working as daily staff at a newspaper, and was kind of designed to teach you how to go make photos with a relatively quick turnaround time and by knowing your community. And some of the things that it was focused on are no longer relevant. Daily newspaper jobs don't exist so much anymore. So some of it's the style that Western Kentucky University tried to inculcate in its students was at times conservative and limiting in a way. When I look at other photographers that studied at more artistic schools. They're able to talk about their photography more and able to like approach photography as a different type of tool than like I originally learned. And now I'm just having to continue to like try new things. But it was definitely useful to like, give a structure to like every week go out and make a photo story every week. Usually the photojournalism classes at Western, you would have every week you would get a theme or an assignment and have to go find a person, shoot a story, get the photos ready and present them in class the next week. And doing that like every week for 4 years just took out a lot of the fear that you were doing it wrong and allowed me to make a lot of the mistakes over that period of time that I probably would have been making had I been working at a newspaper, or if I had been doing that on my own, it would have taken much longer to go through and make all those mistakes and get the feedback. And I think that's probably the best part about going through a formal education is that it gives you a structure to go out and quickly make the mistakes and quickly get the feedback to fix them. While if you're trying to do that on your own, it takes so much more like time and energy to pull together a story, and then a lot more energy to like find someone that'll give you feedback and say, this is good, this is weak. Or what's nice in a classroom is the community of feedback, where you see like we all went out with the same theme and we have 10 different responses to that theme. I could have done any of those. Why did I choose mine and why did they choose theirs?
And in that course, did they talk much about ethics? Was that a big theme or a big focus of the course, or not so much?
Yeah, throughout my time at WKU, journalistic ethics was a major part. Like there were classes specifically devoted to ethics, and then a few professors would spend a lot of the time in class like talking about how to approach people in this, often in times of like hardship, whether a tragedy just happened to them, or they would put a decent amount of time into talking about ethics.
That's great. And when you sort of went out and started working as a photojournalist, how did you navigate some of those ethical dilemmas that might have come up, or what ethical dilemmas did come up, and how did you sort of manage that on the hoof?
I remember being surprised, like when I was in school, we had certain like very strict journalistic ethics. Working at a newspaper, similar, like not leading on people that you're photographing, not like asking them to do things, to reenact things, not moving things around in a scene, and unless it's a portrait. And then like I get to Egypt and I'm surrounded by a bunch of European photographers, and they have often a different set of ethics about like how to both manipulate the scene that they're photographing, but also often how to like over dramatize the events that are happening through their like aesthetic choices of what they're photographing. Another photographer beside me said like, yeah, he was shooting someone, I think it was in Somalia. He was taking pictures of a family in Somalia who had buried a child, but he wanted the photo of them burying the child. So he asked them to dig up the child again and rebury the child. I'm like, there's so many levels of wrong to that it just kind of blew my mind that someone would do that. But you can find that level of like, some might call it devotion to like making the best image. Some might call it like excess ambition to the level of like destructiveness. But you'll run into that out in the world.
How do you, I guess, manage your own ethical integrity in a context in which ethical integrity is not always upheld to the same standard? I guess what I'm trying to get at is I feel like sometimes ethics is viewed quite negatively as something that limits photographers. And of course it does, I'm sure, put many different types of limits on the type of work that you do. Can you talk maybe a little bit about that and how you negotiate that, or how you view that kind of criticism of an ethical approach?
I actually don't think that like my ethics have ever like held me back in getting a photo that I really want to get. I'm sure that if I had like a better imagination, I might come up with like some amazing photo that I want to get, and I want to like somehow direct people to be in the right place at the right time to get it. But for most of my work, like having my own moral guide for how I want to treat other people and layering on top of that my journalistic ethics gives me a clear structure for like how I talk with and interact with other people. And so they can trust me. And so much of the most meaningful stories require that trust. Like we can all tell when someone's kind of skeevy or trying to like manipulate us or trying to get something out of us, even if it's just a subconscious like feeling in a situation. And when we as like journalists approach someone that we don't have a relationship with, it's important to like be upfront about who we are, why we're there, and try to help them understand that like my goal is to accurately represent this situation. You might be afraid of that if you're like doing something bad, but if you want to get your story out, or you're the victim here, or you want like people to know what's happening, then I will do my best to like accurately represent what's happening. Do you want to like collaborate with me on that and let me in? Having those journalistic ethics to like accurately represent the situation is the key to having people open up sometimes.
Yeah, and that really, I guess, reminds me of what you said earlier about how you used the camera initially as a way of interacting with people more or engaging with people more. And I guess that isn't always the case in how maybe people approach photography, because you can take pictures of people without ever having to interact with them, but I think that the way that you're describing this makes a lot of sense in terms of what you're saying about your practice and how that facilitates a different kind of relationship, I guess, where the camera isn't really a barrier between you and the people that you're photographing, but instead a doorway, a point of entry into that relationship, which I think is really, really important and really comes through when you talk about your practice.
The thing that stands out in my head is how when I was younger, I would look at like a lot of the photo books by Magnum photographers, or many of the main photographers, and they'd be doing like street photography, or photography where they're trying to be a fly on the wall in a public space most of the time. And I kind of thought that that was the way to make good photographs, but eventually I found out, no, the best way is to like be inside someone's space, inside where you're no longer a fly on the wall, you're just kind of like accepted and there. And then you can see much more interesting things.
And how did you sort of come to that realization yourself? Because I guess other people have said this as well when I've been speaking with them, that there's a tendency to maybe start out by emulating what we see and what's acclaimed photographers have created, and then over time realizing that actually maybe that's not all it's cracked up to be. So how did you, I guess, sort of shift your thinking, or what caused you to shift your thinking on that?
That was kind of a slow process, but there were times when I did a few workshops. I did especially 2 workshops called the like American Diversity Project workshops, which were just kind of put together by other students at WKU. And my like theme or assignment for those workshops was to like tell the story of a neighborhood. And when you start with in Sonora, Texas, tell the story of a neighborhood in Sonora, Texas. And when I walked around in that neighborhood, I saw the houses, and every once in a while a car would pass by, but it wasn't like a neighborhood that was full of life out on the street in the middle of the day. So I knew like there are people here that do have interesting stories, and it just like required me to talk with them and get into their lives more. I couldn't do this story just by walking around a residential street. That took a lot more work. Like I remember literally, like after the 3rd day, people would open up and I could photograph some, but I wasn't really getting there was a lot of rejection along the way, to where like at one point I was just lying in the front yard of someone's lawn, kind of completely gutted of energy. But eventually I made some work that I was really proud of there. I also could see that difference between stories where people let me into their lives, their daily lives, and where I'm just out on the street. When I went to China for like 9 months, and was in Xinjiang, up in the Uyghur portion of the northwestern China. Even though I learned some of the language and was able to communicate, I wasn't able to get many people to open up to me. And so after 9 months of photographing there, I had pretty street photos, but not much more. And that's probably why when I went to Egypt later, and really based in Egypt, I spent so much time just learning the language for the first few years. By learning Arabic and learning the culture, I was able to tell much more interesting stories.
I guess along those lines of sort of, things that maybe you learned along the way, is there anything else that you really wished that you had known when you first started?
Kind of as a counterpoint to all the advantages to going to a photo school or studying photography, I wish I had spent more time studying other things and really came to photography with a more unique perspective or background information, because so much of making interesting photography depends on having an interesting perspective yourself, or a unique perspective yourself. Often I find my perspective to be kind of boring, or by taking assignments, I know what editors want, and I often consciously or subconsciously try to make the photos they want instead of the photos that I want. And that has, I think, muddled my photography or made it kind of blasé sometimes. So it's quite important to keep your own perspective, keep your own building your own knowledge by mainly reading and hanging out with people that are interesting and different than you.
That's really interesting, because I think it connects so directly to some of the problems that we see in the photo industry, where a certain perspective or a certain way of telling a story is what's desired, what's revered. And it has that sort of top-down stifling effect, doesn't it? That if that's the work that's commissioned, that's the work that gets produced. And it becomes a bit of a cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's luckily I do feel like that is changing. I do feel I remember when I was starting between 2000 and 2010, there was definitely a certain style of photography and stories that were the acceptable storylines to be told and the acceptable styles to be shot. Now that is changing. I say that's changing, but still in Egypt, half of my assignments would be, not half, I'm exaggerating, but many of my assignments would be based around something pharaonic is being dug up, even though the government, the Egyptian government, does that whenever they want to distract from bad news. They'll find a new mummy that they found 2 seasons ago and try to get the international press to cover that. Or in a large part of the world, you look at Tanya Habjuk had the same problem working in Palestine, where a lot of the stories were the same kind of formulaic stories coming out of Palestine. And that's why she did the Occupied Pleasures book of showing the fun people have there, because that stories of fun and relaxation were pretty rare out of Palestine. You look at Kyrgyzstan. I feel most of the stories come out of Kyrgyzstan are about kidnapping brides, which is a terrible thing. But there are more stories in Kyrgyzstan than bride kidnappings. I have never quite found where the hang-up is, if it's editors or it's readers or photographers being trained. We often are stuck in these same cycles of stories.
Yeah, when you were talking there about your experience in Egypt of maybe a bit of a distraction technique being employed to, here, look at the mummies, don't look at this other thing that's happening. it reminded me of something that you said. Obviously, you're an expert contributor in our online training in photojournalism ethics. And I remember in that series, in one of your videos, you're talking about how sometimes, you are hired to go and photograph things that are set up. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you navigate the ethics of something that when you're in that situation, you know that it's set up. But when people are looking at their photographs, they might not know that. And maybe how you try to mitigate the potential harm, or if there is any way even to mitigate the potential harm of sort of buying into and replicating a story that might be inauthentic.
I don't have any easy answer to that. So much of news photography these days are events that are created to be photographed, whether it's a protest or whether it's a politician standing in front of a barn to show how they're a friend of the people. There's an urge within me to always include all the other cameras that are around in the photo, but you can't do that for every photo that gets published. So it's partially incumbent on the readers to be active in thinking about what these events are, even if the photos don't show all the pulleys and gears happening in the background.
I've thought quite a lot about viewer responsibility. And I guess I do wonder, where does some of the responsibility lie in situations like that, for example? Is it with the photographer? Is it with the photo editor? Or is it with the people who are consuming and viewing the images? And how do we understand, where that responsibility lies, and how do people take better care as consumers of images and as producers of images, and how do we navigate complicated questions like that?
Yeah, even back in college, we all saw when Iraq was invaded and the U.S. soldiers went to pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, one of the big statues. It was a beautiful symbolic way of showing that Saddam had fallen from power. But when listening to the photographers who were there, it sounded like it was set up for them. And it was definitely not an organic thing that Iraqis were doing of their own volition. And the soldiers that were there were maybe not as aware at first of how it was looking, because they at first draped an American flag over Hussein's face, and then that looked bad, so they took the flag off and just pulled the statue down. This photo was splashed across the front pages of the US the next day, but reality was far more complex. It was a very symbolic image that vastly oversimplified the reality on the ground.
Yeah, it sounds like in a situation like that, it is really complicated, isn't it, to think about, well, whose responsibility is it to know or to communicate that the reality was so much more complicated? I guess it's in terms of how the photograph is used. But at the same time, I guess that gets very messy because everything is a performance in one way or another. It's a very fine line, isn't it?
Kind of in a similar vein, when the revolution in Egypt happened and protests in Tahrir Square eventually led to the downfall of Mubarak. When Mubarak was the night that he announced that he was leaving, I was in Alexandria and I was shooting for the Wall Street Journal. And so I'd go out in the streets and I'm photographing people celebrating. I get a whole wide variety of photos, even though I have to work pretty fast because the deadline is 8 o'clock and everything happened at 6 o'clock. So I have basically an hour to shoot in the celebrations in the street, get back to the hotel and upload. I remember I took 2 photos that I really liked. One was of a family, relatively religious-looking family. The mother's wearing a niqab. The father's got a long beard, got 4 children, and they're all just belting out the national anthem. They're just super celebrating and happy for this moment. Then I get another photo of a young woman without any head covering, just a younger woman, probably 17 or so, standing out of the sunroof of her car holding an Egyptian flag as it's driving along the Corniche in Alexandria. To me, both photos were good. Both photos were like strong representations of how people were very happy in the moment. But I kind of knew that the photo of the beautiful young woman would probably get published more than the photo of the like family. The reality is like most of Egypt is more like this family, but the beautiful young woman is like more palatable to the American photo aesthetics. So yeah, next morning the photo of the young woman like standing up with the Egyptian flag was published on the front page, and the other one was like lost to history. And I just like had a momentary talk with the editors, and like there apparently had been a lot of discussion that night between the photo editors of like some of them were fighting for one photo and some were fighting for the other photo. So that it wasn't nearly as clear-cut bias in the newsroom as it might appear. But
I guess that's hard though as well when they're also not the ones who are there, and they're also maybe not the ones who are, well, you'd hope that they are fully aware of maybe the demographics of Egypt and sort of what the sentiment is if they're the ones reporting on it. But at the same time, you know, visually they might not be quite as aware of what's more visually representative of Egypt as maybe you are being on the ground.
Yeah, sometimes I send like suggestions to photo editors of what I feel would be the most appropriate photos to publish, like in that situation. But often I don't. I have to trust that they know what's going on.
And at the minute, you're in America at the minute, correct?
Yep. Yeah, up in Boston. Been out photographing the protests for our Black Lives Matter protests. What I want to do is like get back to that walking around neighborhoods that I was talking about earlier, like getting inside people's lives a bit more. But we have such massive, like in your face stories happening right now that the subtler stories are still overlooked by me right at this moment. But I'd like to get back to them.
Yeah, I can understand that. And how's that experience been for you of photographing the Black Lives Matter protests and things? And do you maybe want to or not want to weigh in on the sort of conversation that was happening about faces and how we protect the people in our photographs?
I feel really comfortable in protests. Like it's something that I like a lot of experience in. So I feel comfortable moving around in them. The discussion of like faces in protests is an important one. I don't know. I might have a like built-in bias, but I feel that like photographing journalists should photograph protests in the US as they like normally have and not worry about including people's faces in them in photos that are published. There is some danger from the security services in the US and from like anti-protesters, but I think that they are manageable. I think those dangers are like manageable. But exactly 1 year ago, I was in Sudan photographing protests in Sudan as they overthrew the former president. There was a period of time between the end of July and June 30th when there was a lot of fear in the streets. People were being disappeared. People were just ending up dead in the ravines in Omdurman. Internet was cut. Phone lines were monitored. And people were still trying to organize protests for an eventual June 30th protest by having like neighborhood gatherings, basically. And so I was going to these neighborhood gatherings of like a few hundred people gather in an open area and talk and like rally the troops, basically. And when I was photographing these, like I was very aware not to show people's faces, not to show identifying materials, because there was a significant chance that if leaders were identified, that they would be disappeared, they would be killed. So maybe it's a bias that I have, that like the dangers for US protesters are manageable, but I've made decisions both ways. And I guess the way I made that decision is just by trying to be aware and like very conscious of what the dangers are for everyone involved. I definitely don't want anyone to be hurt from my photos. And actually later, when I spent some more time with some youth organizers for a Black Lives Matter protest here, and they didn't ask me to blur any faces. They didn't put any demands upon me. Instead, they just covered their faces. Everyone wore masks. Everyone, some people covered their hair. They concealed their own identity because they felt it was important. And that's probably the best way to do it. If someone feels that their identity can get them in trouble, or showing their identity can put them in danger, maybe they should conceal their identity. It's not like photojournalists are the only people walking around with cameras these days.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, I guess, that photojournalism ethics and photojournalists adhering to those ethics isn't necessarily protection enough due to the democratization of photography and due to the fact that everybody has a camera. So that is an interesting point about that. And I guess as well, in terms of sort of mitigating the risks of harm coming to people in photographs, I guess that also sort of goes back to approaching people, like you were talking about, I guess, at the start, which of course is, you can't approach everybody at a protest, but I guess making use of that sort of more hands-on and more communicative way of photographing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, there's often a moment, even when in a fast-moving protest, you don't have time, especially with masks on and everyone's kind of separated because it's hard to communicate. But you have that moment where you're lifting the camera up and you make eye contact, and usually someone will nod or they'll make eye contact and then continue with what they're doing. And I take that as accepting my presence there and my even if we aren't talking, we have so much more happening around us.
Something that I want to ask everybody who comes on the podcast is how do you define photography ethics, or what does it mean to you to be an ethical photographer?
My photo ethics go back more to journalistic ethics, being an ethical journalist, trying to accurately portray what's happening. Really, I guess I don't actively think about the ethics in my photography every day that I go out and photograph. Now it's just a constant background method of working. I definitely used to think about it a lot more, but now it's just my journalistic ethics are enmeshed in the way that I work. But it's an important part of what allows me to approach people and try to fairly and accurately tell their stories.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode number 12 are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. This is the final episode in Season 1 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. You can stay connected with us by enrolling in our online courses on photojournalism ethics at www.photoethics.thinkific.com or by following us on social media. We're on Twitter at PhotoEthics and on Instagram at PhotoEthics Center. Thank you very much for joining me throughout Season 1, and stay tuned for the release of Season 2.